So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are dialing in from. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this session to talk about innovative finance and how we can mobilize more finance to conserve the forests, the great forests of South America, whilst also ensuring we continue to underpin food security. Obviously, Brazil, Latin America, so critical for the world's food production, but also so critical in terms of the great forests and the ecosystems, which we know are so crucial to a functioning planet, to the climate system, and to the biodiversity that houses so much life on this precious earth. So we're going to have a discussion over the next hour to talk about these critical issues. We've got a fabulous group of speakers who I will introduce in a moment, but I just want to welcome all of you and thank you for your joining this session. Before we get underway, a couple of housekeeping matters. The panel and the discussion will be in English, but we have simultaneous translation available in Portuguese. So for anybody that would prefer to listen in Portuguese, please click on the interpretation button and you can choose the Portuguese channel to listen in Portuguese. I would also ask people to use the Q&A function. There are going to be, we hope, a lot of questions. We will certainly be coming to all of you and to those questions in the last part of this discussion. So I would encourage you to be writing your questions either to all the panelists or to a specific panelist, so we can then create as an engaging a discussion as possible for this discussion over the next hour. Really important topic, as I said, and so let's get the discussion underway. And I'm absolutely delighted that to start out, to welcome Joaquim Levy, currently the Director of Economic Strategy and Market Relations at Banco Safra, but also, as many, hopefully all of you know, the former Minister of Finance for Brazil, the former President of the critically important Brazilian Development Bank, BNDES, and a senior executive previously with the World Bank. So brings a whole host of experience to this discussion. Joaquim, really delighted you can be with us, and the floor is yours as you help set the scene and the context of what we're going to be discussing.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. Let me say a few words, and first to acknowledge that it's a privilege to participate in this session during such an important week to discuss a subject that is at the heart of climate action, food security, as you mentioned, and also the future of Latin America. The challenge to move towards net zero carbon emissions is global, and each country or region has its own issues to address in succeeding in this journey. Well, Brazil is blessed for having been able to harness large amounts of renewable energy, thanks to the work of millions that have built our hydropower system, who produce our biofuels, and are now expanding our solar and wind power parks. But we have yet to overcome deforestation, especially in the Amazon. It is now crucial that we ensure that the fruits of our agriculture are sustainable in all senses, with a low carbon print and not encroaching on the Amazon. I think achieving this is it's in our own interest, because our forests are the linchpin of our agriculture, our hydropower, and more broadly, the survival of our cities and our country. The same is true, I believe, to our neighbors in South America and to a large extent around the world. I'd say that the realization of the importance of aligning our agriculture with the fight against climate change is really changing minds in the agricultural sector in Brazil. The interest of our commercial partners in this issue, I have to acknowledge, has helped promote these new perceptions and also the efforts to move forward timely and effectively for a goal of less deforestation. It has also led our private banks to step up their engagement with the agricultural sector and the Amazon. And I also note the work of our central bank in this sense. So we recognize that we need to work hard to stop the conversion of forests and other natural vegetation in the Amazon, but also in the Cerrado and the Chaco, all these biomes in South America. Because in the case of Brazil, we cannot afford to deforest more than 1 million hectares a year. And beef and soy production cannot be drivers of deforestation anywhere in Latin America. We also know that there are ways to achieve this transformation, to overcome these challenges. And let's be clear, the impression that some have that deforestation is a necessary evil to feed a growing global population or to ensure the development of the Amazon is false. And the corporate and financial worlds don't buy that idea anymore. Preventing the clearing of rainforests is unlikely to harm economic growth in South America. I have witnessed that in the late 2000, early 2010, curbing deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon as accompanied by rising agricultural production and welfare to many. I'm sure that deforestation-free production can deliver better overall economic performance and more jobs while improving local livelihoods that derive economic value from standing forests, including indigenous people and traditional communities. Well, now new business models are available to grow production and incomes while avoiding further biodiversity loss or water, climate, or social negative impacts. We already know, for instance, that soy can expand without further habitat loss on already cleared pasture lands in the Cerrado instead of deforesting that use the degraded pasture land. And actually, the Nature Conservancy estimates that there are about 18 million hectares actually, that of cleared pasture land, many of that are degraded, that would be more than enough for expanding the production in the next decade, in this decade, until 2030. I believe we will need about 5 to 7 million hectares to do that. And well, I hear that there are, for instance, programs already like the Syngenta Reverte project that are a very good example of this approach. And they have this goal of recovering about 1 million hectares of Cerrado, and they put together a finance program to make it possible. I could also mention something that is starting, which is a responsible commodities facility that is being put together, which is also dedicated to finance deforestation and conversion-free soybeans. With respect to cattle ranching, there is an increase, say, efforts to intensify this activity and to use landscape agriculture, what you call in Brazil, this integrated crop, livestock, and forestry production. And with these to free land for regeneration and also to integrate with production of a number of other products. We know that the average productivity is still low in Brazil, and by investing, we can actually have very interesting solutions that could even to be carbon neutral or even negative if you measure adequately, for instance, the increase of organic carbon in the soil. And again, TNC has just clinched a very interesting agreement with a very large corporation to work with that, with converting some pasture land, intensify the production, and also to promote the production of acai, cocoa, and many other fruits that we hope will become household names in coming years, freeing land for reforestation in the Amazon. We are confident about of several of these approachments and also of expanding lending and investment for these climate-friendly beef and soy production models. And I think that getting this through is really an important piece of the puzzle of transforming food production in these biomes, and I think even beyond that. Of course, finance complements and needs other efforts such as supply chain sourcing commitments, traceability system that now some states are supporting, and public policy and jurisdictional approaches, which really increase the scope of carbon credits and carbon trade. We know that although finance alone will not solve the problems, it will be key to scale up approaches and techniques that have been proved effective and others that are being introduced now. My experience shows that when viable business models are established and public policies are coherent with them, capital tends to flow in direction of these businesses. Let me step back 1 second and note that financing in Brazil has changed substantially since the middle of the last decade, with less prominence of public banks and an acceleration of a downward shift of interest rates, which makes many more things possible. You expect that the expansion of private credit and the development of new instruments will continue. And I mentioned here the recent creation of the agricultural investment funds, the FIAGRO, that I'm sure some will talk about, as well as the expansion of CRAs, which are certificates backed by agro receipts and planned to be traded either locally or internationally, which again is the basis of that responsible commodity facility and other innovative projects that are appearing. And government is helping because they are offering tax advantage to some of these instruments. But there are hurdles that may require the support of public policy in a broader way to support these new approaches and also to help to manage the risk. Because we know that to have this conversion of, for instance, degraded land, we'll need to have the financing matching the multi-year payback of this type of investment, which is very different from the game of financing the typical cycle of say of soybeans, which lasts less than 6 months every year. So we are now seeing many players, such as input providers, trading companies, and cooperative banks, forming a sort of an ecosystem, which is ready to attract a broad range of investors. With this new landscape, there's a lot of interest by private investors, sometimes with the help of a blended finance. We need to bring in new domestic and foreign players, because actually to achieve this transformation will require several dozen of billions of dollars of investment, maybe 20, 30 billion in the next few years. So we have to mobilize a very large base of investors. Now, to scale this implementation up, we need the new instruments, develop techniques of managing risk, and as I also mentioned, to measure the impacts, because this is fundamental to create the new market so that people know what they are buying. And in this sense, I think it's also worth mentioning that we need to build carbon credit markets and offsetting mechanisms so that you get also price signals that will facilitate the attraction and the mobilization, both of suppliers, of farmers, but also of investors. Nature-based solutions need to be part of domestic and global voluntary as well as regulated carbon market. We should not fool ourselves. And also blending finance and philanthropy will be important, especially because you need also to address the specific needs of small producers. Because without genuine a social focus, it would be very difficult to stop deforestation. And this is why I believe the innovative finance for the Amazon, Cerrado, and Chaco, the IFACC we are launching today in a partnership of TNC, TFA, World Economic Forum, and UNEP, is so important and timely. The goal of IFACC, you probably know, is to accelerate lending and investment for climate-friendly beef and soy production in the region. And it has two main thrusts. First, to bring together leading banks, companies, investors, as well as asset managers to signal their collective and individual commitments to expand lending and investment in these areas. A second line is to support signatories to implement and scale up new finance mechanisms, including with environmental social management, connections to concessional capital groups and other capital providers, and also sharing the best intelligence on who is doing what and what is working or not, and also making accessible the best available data and studies on the business case and impacts. All of these are pieces for a really functioning market. And I believe that such a knowledge platform will help bring trust and transparency to this nascent market, bolstering its ability to transform agriculture and the production of meat in South America. So I look forward to hear from our panelists today, who all have a long and illustrious track record in this area, and to listen to their experiences in raising and deploying capital to expand food production without deforestation, their challenges, and what it takes to scale this effort up to a level say in line with the challenge that we have, this exciting challenge, actually, because I believe we can do that and increase the productivity of our lands. So let me finish. As banks and companies come together this week and for the COP in Glasgow to strengthen their resolve to decarbonize the economy, it becomes clear that decarbonizing food production is a critical imperative, and it can do that with nature. And that is our task, to develop financial tools to scale up proven techniques and finance them and further innovations, because they are key steps for us to move forward in the road toward net zero in an inclusive way, and really using all the advantage that our countries have been blessed with. So it's very, very exciting to be in this panel, and I really look forward to hear from you. Thank you.
Joaquim, muito obrigado. That was a tour de force of so much that you've just covered, and I can't possibly do justice to everything, but I love the central message that you're giving of decarbonizing food production and the ability to scale agricultural production to feed the world. And we know even in the next decade, there's an estimated 1.8 billion people are going to enter the middle class, right, with their increased consumption that comes from that. And so how do we meet the needs of those consumers without destroying the forest? And you've laid out a number of ways that can happen. You've given a number of examples. You've talked about land availability. You've talked about the need to be inclusive with producers. And I think you've given the panel a great deal to kind of respond to and think about as we now move forward. But I think most importantly, you've given us hope. One initiative you talked about, which we're announcing today, but will formally launch during the climate conference in Glasgow in 6 weeks' time, is IFACC, this innovative finance for the Amazon, the Cerrado, and the Chaco. And this is a collaboration between UNEP, the Nature Conservancy, the Tropical Forest Alliance, hosted by the World Economic Forum. And it's there to really bring forward the practical advice to all the financiers who are starting to think about how they can support this transition. the billions of dollars you talked about that are going to be needed to drive the transition, to think about how we're going to monitor progress and how we can start to demonstrate turning the tide in terms of productivity and food production, whilst reducing that environmental impact and ensuring the livelihoods of the producers. That input from farmers and the producers is also going to be critical, and really to provide visibility for this whole movement. So that's what IFACC is. There's a web link there. I'd ask one of my colleagues to post that in the chat so any of the participants can see that. It gives you a little bit more information. And then, as we talked about, we will formally launch that with some financial commitments in just a few weeks' time. But to build on that and to start to get really practical with some examples, I'm delighted that we've got 3 panelists now who are going to talk about some of the specific business models that they are putting in place. Joaquim talked about the viable business models. So we're going to hear first from Juan Gonzalez Valero, the head of sustainable and responsible business at Syngenta, a major input company, and who works with hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of farmers around the world and in Brazil and Latin America. So we'll hear first from Juan of what it is to work with the farmers and the issues they're working with. Then we'll turn to Wei Peng, the head of sustainability for grains and oilseeds for the Louis Dreyfus Company, one of the major trading companies in the world. And then we'll hear from Katarina Elias Trussman, the head of sustainability and ESG from BNP Paribas Brazil, about banking and how the private banks are starting to mobilize capital and think about some of these transitions. So Juan, if I could turn to you first, please talk about what you are already doing to work with farmers and to drive some of this transition that Joaquim has talked so much about.
Thanks, Justin, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I think Joaquim set the scene right, and he already mentioned the project that I want to raise with you and explain a little further that we're doing in Brazil. It's called Reverter, and Reverter is a program that looks at how we can restore degraded land, degraded pasture land, and put it into a production system that is economically viable and allow with that to increase the productivity along the lines that Justin just mentioned, the increase that we expect in the demand that will raise over the next years and will not stop anytime soon. And we have to actually cope with it by actually looking at where is already land that has been cleared, that is being used for agriculture for a long time, and how can we really move that into a more productive scheme that is inclusive of the production that we need for the future. As mentioned, we've committed to go into 1 million hectares within the next couple of years, but the potential, of course, is much, much bigger. If we look at Brazil and we look at the cleared land, the degraded pastures that are around in Brazil, we're talking nearly 200 million hectares of degraded pasture land that is used very extensively for cattle growing, and the value of the land is not really used to its full potential. When we went into this area is area that can easily be restored and even be in part reforested and still be productive if you look at it with a more agronomic, through a more agronomic lens, and try to bring rotations in that include crop production and cattle production at the same time. We looked at it, and at least around 5 million, if not more, hectares are easily accessible and convertible with modern machinery, and you can, with the right investment, turn that land fairly quickly into productive land. And that's where we are focusing on. We're trying to look at those 5+ million hectares that are available at this point in time for a quick transition to demonstrate that the system works. The basics are very straightforward. The integrated pasture and land management systems are well established and researched in Brazil. We have, from the input side, looked into our genomics, looked if we have seeds that would fit into those pasture lands at this point in time and start improving them. So put breeding programs in place to actually improve the germplasm and the fit for purpose germplasm in order to start increasing productivity on this degraded land. From a chemical and fertilizer input side, I think we have the solutions at hand as well. What is absolutely missing is all the infrastructure necessary to actually start with crop production in that part of the world. So we looked at it and looked at the business model for the farmer. What does it take for a farmer to actually start leasing land in these areas in order to introduce crop production, or convert the land himself and invest into that transition to start implementing these agronomic practices that are well known to actually improve the soil conditions and the productivity if implemented. But that investment is a long-term investment. The transition takes 3 to 5 years to really become fully productive. So you need patient capital that is put into those farms, into the hand of the farmer, in order to start with the transition process. So our innovation process was the seeds, the inputs. It was the frameworks. It was working with the Nature Conservancy and other organizations to set the right environmental criteria in place to evaluate the project. But most importantly, in the context of today's conversation, to set up a finance mechanism in place that would allow the farmer to invest, to access that money, to make the investments into the infrastructure in order to start the transition.
So Juan, let me interrupt you a minute, because I just want to direct you just one question before I move across to Wei. So you talk about the long-term capital, absolutely critical, but there's also sort of farmer behavior, and it's not just capital. So how do you incent, and what's the response rate you're starting to see from farmers in terms of taking this up? This is a different proposition from just the business as usual, to take land, to convert, or to start to restore that land. How are you seeing farmers respond to that?
Well, within the pilot year that we have, 2020 is our pilot year, we already have more than 30,000 hectares. We have about 200 farmers at the moment interested in learning more about it. And we have enough signed up to actually start demonstrating that it works. The interest of the farmer in getting into the land and doing the transition is fairly high. The barrier of entry is the investment necessary. Let's face it, it is not the agronomy, it is not the interest of the farmer. You may put some environmental criteria in place that lead into some form of discussion. Is that still feasible or not? But that's something that you can sort out with time. But if you don't get access to affordable capital that is patient over a couple of years in order to make the investment, because you have to invest in machinery, you have to invest in storage room, you have to invest in sanitary facilities, you have to actually build a farm in order to make this transition possible. So it's not just that the land is there, you need to bring the infrastructure into that land, and somebody has to pay for it to start with. Somebody needs to take the risk into their books, and that's typically the farmer. What we've agreed, we've taken some of the risk for the inputs at least into our books. So we share the risk with the farmer in order to bring the cost of the capital down. But at the end, you need the relationship between the land owner or the land leaser and the bank that actually lends the money to this person, and that's the entry barrier.
Very good. Well, we're going to hear from two other panelists now, both of whom work with farmers and provide working capital and longer term loans. And Wei, I wonder if I could turn to you from your experience with LDC, working with farmers to produce the grains that you're then trading internationally and locally. And where you see the barriers to how you're scaling some of the solutions for exactly the type of issue that Juan just talked about.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to exchange on this very important topic today. Indeed, Louis Dreyfus, we run our pre-financing programs in Brazil to finance the annual crop production of some of our suppliers. So in addition, we also piloted an additional long-term financing line to support the expansion of soy production on degraded pasture. In terms of scale, this is not anywhere near what Syngenta has been able to pull off, but the intention is to keep exploring this space and to keep expanding the scope of our work in this area, and would actually very much welcome any collaboration opportunities with Syngenta in this space. So I think in terms of some barriers, indeed, I think we've learned lessons and experiences in the past. I think the first challenge is we do experience some challenge in terms of bringing farmers on board. I think this discussion with the farmers on these projects needs to be a business-focused one. It's beyond a pure conservation discussion. We need to find an effective way to convey the fact that avoiding deforestation is also about protecting the long-term yield and productivity of their existing land, and to help build the business case for farmers to become interested and invested in this partnership with us. Again, and in our current work, we are providing that financing from our own working capital. So everything is sitting on our own balance sheet. But definitely, I think it is for the scaling up, we need partnerships with the financial community in order to pull off programs of larger scale. I think here there are some, of course, other challenges in terms of formulating an attractive enough financing offer for the farmers, and of course for everybody else involved. It is not straightforward to price the environmental value of such projects, and also financing nature positive solutions is a relatively new territory. There's, as other panelists mentioned, there's unknown risks that still need to be understood and priced properly and shared. And then, so probably beyond the capabilities of pure private finance, we need the blending of public finance to help reduce the risks and mitigate some of these risks as well. So I think also the relatively low interest rates and high soy prices in Brazil in the past 2 years are not creating a most favorable condition to attract farmers into these programs as we speak. So again, I think one more lesson that I've observed personally is financing alone is not enough. There is a need for a whole bundle of services that Juan has also mentioned. What about technical support? What about the ongoing monitoring and the measurement of the impact that projects are creating? Is there a market incentive in addition to what we are offering to the farmers? Is there a price premium for the soy that is produced from restored degraded pasture land? So is the market willing to pay extra to reward the farmers that are putting so much efforts and resources and taking so much risks to actually make it happen? I think these are fundamental questions that need to be answered by the whole value chain stakeholders. So I personally think the creation of IFACC is actually a great opportunity to bring these stakeholders together for some meaningful and relevant discussions and share lessons and practices and forge collaboration at scale. So I think the composition of today's panel is a great example of the key stakeholders that are needed for these conversations, from financing, inputs, trading, and of course the NGO community, and probably many more other stakeholder groups that are needed to forge this kind of collaboration.
Super, and I mean, again, so much richness in what you've just said. I wonder just if you could help for the audience, just unpack you just said something with the low interest rates and the high soy prices. Actually, it's even harder to recruit farmers today. I mean, just give people an understanding of what those dynamics are, what that means for the farmer if they're accepting loans, if they're accepting long-term contracts, just so they understand that a little bit more.
Yes, I'm not an expert in this, but I'll try. Other panelists, please feel free to chip in here as well. Again, I think if you look at Brazil soy farmers, around a third of them is self-financed. around a third of them is financed by financial institutions, and then the remaining third is financed by input providers such as Syngenta, trading companies such as Louis Dreyfus and many of our peers. So when there is easily accessible, cheap financing from other avenues, then it puts extra pressure on the financial offers that we need to make under this program in order to attract farmers into this collaboration with us. When there is easy access and cheap financing available elsewhere, then their interest level all of a sudden drops. And also, again, in our case, the one condition for the farmer to join this program is that they have to make a group level commitment to non-conversion and non-deforestation. So as a precondition, this is difficult because for them to commit to, because the soy prices have been gone up, skyrocketing in the past 2 years. So so for them, there is a huge opportunity cost for making this commitment. So this is again another reason that makes bringing farmer on board a little bit extra challenging. Again, but these market dynamics are constantly evolving. We're confident that we will return into the space where the overall attractiveness will come back, and also with the introduction of additional funding, and again at a ideal price, and the risk appetite from financial partners. Hopefully, this would also improve the overall attractiveness of such programs for farmers.
Terrific. Well, yeah, so I just think it's really important everybody understands these dynamics, these record soy prices that we're seeing, which obviously drive so many farmers to try and maximize their production. And at the same time, we're trying to sort of engineer this deeper shift that you're all talking about. But the collaboration up and down the value chain, absolutely crucial. As you've touched about, it's great that you're on the same panel as Syngenta and we can develop more synergies there. But let's now turn to Carreira and bring a perspective from one of the key banks in Brazil, and how you're thinking about this and the type of finance you're thinking about providing to producers and indeed to the other market actors to drive some of the transition that we talked about.
So I think I'd like to start off by saying why sustainable agriculture is important for us as a bank. And I'm going to actually quote a former colleague of mine from WRI. His name is Richard Waite. He's a senior research associate for food and agriculture. He once tweeted this. It was a very successful tweet. You'll probably see why. Worried about biodiversity loss, focus on food. Worried about fresh water supply and quality, focus on food. Worried about deforestation, focus on food. Worried about climate change, focus on energy and food. So the importance of sustainable agriculture and our global food system is that it interlinks with so many other sectors: water, energy, biodiversity, human rights, land rights, etc. And within that context of climate change, we now know how urgent climate action is. The latest IPCC report highlights this, and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, last week, he said that we're on course for an average temperature increase of 2.7 degrees Celsius between now and the end of the century. So our climate action needs to be transformative, systemic, rather than incremental. And that is the opportunity that sustainable agriculture affords us. So globally, agriculture in the food system contributes roughly 1/3 of the world's emissions. So when we think about agriculture, we're actually thinking about a global system with impacts on climate, water, energy, biodiversity, etc. And this positions the need to transition to a sustainable agriculture model as a systemic opportunity. And that's in line with the systemic climate action that we need. That's how we understand the opportunity at BNP Paribas. We understand that a sustainable agriculture and food system is essential for the long-term prosperity of both humanity and biodiversity, as well as for reaching net zero carbon and global climate targets. So banks and other financial institutions have a really crucial role to play in supporting the transition of agriculture to more sustainable models. And at BNP Paribas, we do this through two main levers: one, through our global policies that govern how we finance, and two, also through our financial products and commitments. So on the policy side, for example, we recently updated our global agriculture policy, which sets 2025 as the deadline for our clients to achieve zero deforestation in the meat and the soy supply chains in both the Brazilian Amazon and Cerrado. We also require our clients to map and trace their indirect supply chains for beef and soy by 2025, so the same deadline. And we require them to regularly communicate and publish results on these efforts to support transparency. The policy was designed in line with industry best practice, like the Accountability Framework Initiative. And we also importantly engaged our clients to really understand what measures are they implementing now, what are the key risks that they face, and where are they going. So we really want to be the financial partner that can support our clients on that transition journey. And in terms of financial commitments and products, this year we reinforced, for example, our commitment to preserving biodiversity. Biodiversity is really important for sustainable agriculture and food system. And by 2025, we aim to reach 3 billion euros in financing linked to the protection of terrestrial biodiversity. We want to assess our corporate clients on biodiversity-related criteria, and we'll also be investing 250 million euros in startups mobilized for the ecological transition.
That's wonderful. I mean, firstly, great to hear the clear policies. And I think we're seeing more and more of that from the financial sector as to how those policies are then going to affect the finance that is flowing in. So great to hear that reinforced from you. And then this sort of mobilizing new finance, this 3 billion euros that you're talking about, of how we start to make the shift. So what are some of the barriers that you see and you're concerned about as you're looking to try and get that money out? You talk very eloquently about the need to transition the system, but we all know it's not transitioning nearly fast enough. So what are those barriers that you see from a banking perspective?
Sure, I think some of the panelists touched upon this. One of the key barriers is risk. How do we price, quantify, and integrate risk, presented by the climate crisis, but also the biodiversity crisis, into financial models? So it's really all about integrating those externalities. We are on a path where in the future, biodiversity and climate indicators will be taken into account in credit and risk committees, which will lead to better financial decision-making. So this ultimately helps us shift financing away from perhaps less sustainable practices and helps shift financing towards more sustainable activities, projects, measures, etc. To do this, we need proper frameworks and methodologies. We need to be able to measure, manage, and disclose data in a harmonized way across different sectors. And that is, for example, the objective of the two task forces, right? The Task Force for Climate and Nature-related Financial Disclosures, and BNP Paribas actually was part of the informal working group that launched the TNFD. I think that's one barrier. I think the other barrier is what the other panelists touched upon, is how do we bring finance to scale for sustainable agriculture, whereby by 2050, we're going to have to be feeding 10 billion people through sustainable agricultural methods. So through zero land conversion, through zero deforestation, better water management, but also restoring degraded ecosystems and bringing the farmers along that journey, right, in an inclusive way. This also requires monitoring the impacts and the benefits from the financing and supporting the farmers to make that transition. And I think also we have to bear in mind that whilst we provide the financing, we also need to make sure that the policies exist that we limit our exposure to deforestation. So again, that message of shifting financing away from and towards. And I think another really interesting angle that is emerging is financing for forests. So we're seeing new financing models emerge from banks and other financial institutions. One of those models is blended finance. We've spoken, there's been some great references to blended finance on this panel. To bring blended finance to scale, I think we need three things. One, we need increased and strengthened coordination between financing actors, foundations, philanthropic actors, multilateral development banks, as well as private banks. So really linking up that financial value chain. Two, we need to deploy technical capacity or readiness programs to accelerate a pipeline of bankable projects at scale. And three, we need to engage investors and raise their awareness on how to increase forestry investments. That's why I think it's really great to be here on this panel where we're launching the IFACC, where you are launching the IFACC.
Thank you, Katerina. And I would also just highlight the sort of points that were made by Wei a moment ago, that if a third of the finance is coming from private banks, a third is coming from the other members of the value chain, sort of input companies, traders, they are crucial partners in this as well. And then of course, a third is self-finance, right? Thinking about how all of that works together, we think is going to be key for what blended finance really going to mean. So I'm going to open up just to some of the questions that are there. Some great questions in the Q&A. We're not going to get to all of them, but there's one here around this sort of degraded land model that Juan in particular you talked about the clear, is there clear ownership of that? So, you know, the clear, you know, there's all these millions of hectares of degraded land. You talked about 200 million hectares across the whole of Brazil, but where is the landowner in that? And you talk about lease models, but is that clear for how that can work for farmers and landowners together? Is that going to be a barrier? So that's just one question. Maybe you could touch on that briefly, and then we'll pull in a few others. Yeah. And then Joachim, I'm going to come back to you for some reflections on everything you've heard from all the panelists.
No, sure, Justin. I think that one is easy to answer. We can only start building kind of commercial relationship if the ownership situation is actually clear. So those hectares that are under contract at this point in time have a clear ownership. I talked about lease contract, and that's related to one of the other questions that was actually in here. What we've seen and what has worked during the pilot phase is that farmers had established crop farmers had an interest to extend their production area and looked at this degraded land through our model in order to invest in that model. So they actually write the leasing contract with the landowner, and then you start deploying and building the relationship. So there's a long-term contract between basically the farmer that actually starts managing the land and the landowner. And I have to say, the reason why it's mainly in those terms at this point in time is just the amount of money that has to be actually raised and the securities that the farmer who actually lends that money has to actually put in place in order to do that. And that's where the limitations are in reality, you know, because we talk a lot about finance mechanisms and everything else, but the mechanism to actually get the millions of investment into the hands of a farmer and with that trust them to actually pay back that money is to me the biggest barrier, and at the moment limits it to where you have fairly good regulated system in the background and farmers that actually are there for a while and have already a good relationship with the bank in order to actually build that trust relationship. So that's something to keep in mind at this point in time.
Really, really helpful. And I want to turn now a couple of questions about rights of Indigenous people, and maybe I could turn to you, Carreira. I'm sure your rights are a critical part of how you're also thinking about your portfolio. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the aspect of respecting Indigenous rights and getting free informed prior consent is completely integrated in our global agriculture policy. And the way that we apply these policies means that every single transaction, product and client, they're screened against these policies so that we can ensure that these criteria are upheld when we emit the financing. So it's incredibly important. Indigenous people and Indigenous communities are forest guardians. We know how much they contribute to conservation. It's incredibly important that we respect their rights. And it is absolutely in our interest also as a bank to support that. It would be counter to our interests if we didn't uphold those rights. So it's fully integrated into how we govern, or how we also almost curate our financing, particularly from that risk perspective.
Very, very good. So questions are coming in thick and fast, and I'm conscious that I can't even keep up as they all arrive. So apologies for that. People talking about Colombian and Peruvian Amazon. There's obviously other mechanisms being talked about there. That's not going to be the focus of this discussion today, but lots of the same issues apply, but different commodities, different geography systems. There's several questions around the sort of link to carbon finance, and does this link to some of the carbon methodologies, Vera, gold standard, that are being talked about? And yeah, I think, I mean, I'd love any perspective on that from panelists, but I mean, it may be one of the mechanisms, but it's not the central mechanism that we're talking about here. But I don't know, Wei or even Joachim, if you want to comment on that and where you see that might fit. Clearly, not without its controversies as well. But any thoughts on that? Some of the questions focused on that. Joachim, you're on mute, or Wei, go ahead first, and then Joachim.
Could you restate? I mean, there's several interesting things being discussed, but what is your last question?
So the question was just if you know, there's people asking questions about the role of carbon finance, and it hasn't been central to the discussion. How important do you see that in terms of the bigger transition finance that will be needed? Just a quick thought on that.
Okay, I just want to be sure. Okay, I think it's important. There are certain things that are, say, financing in a way. I mean, you go to some people, some farmers in Brazil, and they are used to have like 2 crops in their lands, and if they realize they can have 3 crops, because in the dry season they can just plant grass and have cattle there, and then they can finish the cattle using some residuals of their other crops. They can see that that's a very nice way to maximize the return in their land, and that they have capital and they do that. And actually they are buying, and they're ready to buy degraded land, also because they've learned how to transform bare land on productive land, sometimes with more or less attention to organic process. So there is this trend, but there are a lot of other things that could get a cushion if the benefits that they are bringing to, say, the atmosphere is recognized and is priced. And I think that one great advantage of having a market, especially if it's more or less, say, a regulated market, is to force a certain transparency, because the market presumes that you have a price and you know what you're buying, what you're selling, and these will force to have, say, standards and way to measure and so on, and create incentives to people to do that. So either voluntary or even a regulated market, carbon market, can make a big difference. And also, there are studies in Brazil, some done with the help of the World Bank, that show that even small amounts of say, compensation, say $10 for a ton of CO2, could really help finance and start some of this transformation. Actually, some of the things that TNC are financing are based with that. So there are companies for reputational purpose or whatever, because they have made a pledge to get to net zero, they're willing to help finance some of these transformations so that they can claim the credit in the future because of the reduction in emissions they have achieved. Well, they can claim just to satisfy their, say, their needs in terms of their pledges. But if this works well, I'm pretty sure that they would like also to sell some of these carbon credits. So to have some sort of a market with clear rules will certainly help all these efforts. And also in some cases would help address this time mismatch that was mentioned by some of the other panelists, and I mentioned that we're talking about things that may take, say, 3-5 years really to start to process. I mean, to make all the changes that you have to make in a degraded pasture land takes a few years. Actually, you have to have some cycles of a production to get the nitrogen and everything in place. So this requires time, and having some sort of additional finance can help. I particularly believe that you have much more room through a market, a carbon market, well regulated and well monitored, with all the integrity that it needs to have, than really to sit and wait for money from, say, government donors and so on. They exist. they are welcome, but are not in the magnitude of the challenge.
Very good.
You bring this money.
Thank you, Joachim. So we are rapidly running out of time, and I'm going to just turn to the other three panelists for a closing thought in terms of what gives you hope, or one thought you want to leave people with. But 30 seconds, if you could, just one thing you want to leave the audience with today. So Juan, to you first.
I can start. Everything that we can do to actually lower the cost of the money that goes to farmers and make it easier to access it will enable this reversion of degradation significantly. And just to add, at the moment, carbon would be a nice way of doing it, but none of the protocols is really allowing the conversion of pasture land into cropland in order to get a credit rate. So the systems are not supportive of this mechanism at this point in time, but we need to work in order to make this happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Wei.
Yes, I assume that many of the participants for today's session are actually in the financial community. So this is more of a raising our hands saying we're here to collaborate. You're not alone. You're not expected to make the financing happen on your own. There are across the board a lot of other stakeholders. We have the knowledge about the farmers. We interact with them. We have a lot of information and knowledge about the farmers, which are not necessarily accessible at the moment for the financial community, but we are more than willing to work together and share that knowledge and share that access and partner to leverage the collective efforts and resources that we have to make deals happen. I think we just need the confidence to see more pilots happening and at a larger scale, and then eventually to really lift up this transition together. So thanks.
Thank you, Wei. Katerina.
Sure, a bit like Wei, I also looked at who's in the participant list. Amazing people, and one of the privileges of working on this in Brazil, I've been here for 9 years, is just the amount of incredible ideas and solutions. And the challenge that we face is systemic problems require systemic solutions. And everything that we've spoken about today gives me hope, because one, it's not just one solution that will solve what we're facing. It's not just carbon markets, it's not just technical assistance or ecosystem degradation. It's the host, it's the plethora and the integrated approach and all the solutions that we've discussed. That gives me hope. And every week I get new invitations, new ideas being launched. So I really think we're on a trajectory where, one, we will integrate the risks into our decision making, and two, also deploy solutions to really provide the right incentives to make that transition as swiftly as possible and in the most inclusive and just way, which is incredibly important. So thank you very much, everyone, for the inspiration.
Thank you. Joachim, a very, very last word to you, and then I will wrap up in less than a minute. So any final thoughts from you, Joachim?
No, I just follow Catherine. It's exciting, everything that is happening. And I think that the initiative of the facility, the IFACC, is really timely, is very useful. And I hope that you get very quickly to the 3 billion that we need. We can do it. This is, I think, it's really science-based, and you bring a lot of good for the world in terms of better food for everybody.
Terrific. Well, thank you. And I want to thank all the panelists for really, really terrific, engaging conversation, lots of great ideas, lots of great examples. I want to thank all of the participants, just the number of ideas, the things that are popping up in the chat, the links to reports. Thank you for all of that. And I think that exemplifies just sort of how much energy there is in the community right now for some of these solutions. We've heard about other things that Joachim talked about, a responsible commodities facility, but please kind of follow the launch of IFACC at Glasgow in a few weeks' time. There will be significant financial commitments there, including some long-term funds that we think can really make a difference along the lines that we've heard from some of the panelists today. But my takeaways from this, the innovation, the ideas that are starting to pop up are really, really exciting and do give us hope, right? None of this is easy, and people are in the chat enabling policy environment, other things that need to shift. Yes, they do, but we can and we must continue to innovate and drive, because I think we can imagine and shape a very different future through the types of ideas that are here today. And then the second really big thing that I think has come up time and time again, it has to be through collective action. We can't do it on our own. And that is what Wei has been talking about. It's what Juan's talked about, Katerina, Joaquin. It's like, that's how we're now going to sort of drive this. And it's got to be collaboration up and down the value chain. It's got to be civil society. It's got to be government working together to unlock this. And together we can actually shape this in a very, very different way. So let's keep the innovation going. Let's keep the collective collaboration there. And I think we can really start to see a difference, and IFACC will play a small part in bringing a more holistic perspective to all of this and mobilizing more of these commitments as we go forward. Thank you. Apologies, we've overrun 2 minutes, but thank you all panelists, thank you all participants, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the months and years ahead. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you very much.